All right, so really quick recap of what we've done so far. We want to create an object called user. And the reason we want to do that is if you're developing a website, you don't want to have to re-hand code user objects every time you want to create a new user. What you'd like to do is have an object already set up with all the attributes that you'd want in a user account. And the first thing we want to do is give that object data, right? So what we do is we set up a class and we give it a place to store all the data and the different behaviors that we want a user to have. So the data is a state of being, right? If I am me, I have a username and my own password. Those are things that are, right? And then my user account can also do stuff. I can change my password. I can maybe make posts on an internet forum. I can do things as well. That's where your methods come in, or your functions. So we're going to start with the first function of an object. And the first function of an object is to actually build the object. And building the object basically just means setting data onto our variables. So constructors always called the same thing. Double underscores on either side in it stands for initialization, and then we set it up like a regular function in any other way. Okay? First parameter of any of these functions that are going to be inside an object are always self. And self is a reference back to the name of the object, which we'll cover again in a second. So if I have a user object, right, the first thing I'm going to need on my user object is probably a username. That would probably be the first thing you think of when you think of like your email account or your Facebook thing or Instagram or whatever else. So you have a username, you have a password, and if I'm being smart, I'm going to give you a permanent user ID that I can use to refer to you in case I need to. So now I'm going to define variables, and these are just going to be containers to hold the data that belongs to my object. These are called instance variables in this case because they're the first things that are going to be created when I build a new object. Anything inside of this def init, right, is going to be an instance variable. It means this stuff gets created before you can do anything else with your eventual object. So first one is self, and they're all prefixed by self dot. Self dot username equals UN. Okay. Self dot pass. I'm going to shorten that. Equals password. So there's my username. There's my password. Everyone with me so far? Yes.
Why do you put self input?
Self we're going to cover in just a second, but it refers back to the name of the object. So I'll go. Once we actually create an object, then I'll show you how the self dot works. One thing that I did wrong here, and you guys are going to have to think about logically as you're creating objects, especially as we start getting into building websites and even your Unity projects. ID, is that something that I'm going to pull in from the outside? No, it doesn't really have any business being inside of parameters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that equal to a random number. We do have to import random, and that's a tricky part with this, so I'm going to go over it with you. I want to lock this to 4 digits, so I'm going to set that between 1000 and 9999. Import random, it can get a little confusing with all this stuff, but it's the same no matter what. Ever, when you're working with Python, anything that you're going to import, any modules that you're going to import from the outside, you do that before you do anything else. Even if you're setting up a class, objects, whatever. first thing is always your import statements. Okay, so this will give us a random number that's locked to 4 digits. Then after that, the thing that we have to understand is once I create an object from the user class, this constructor is going to go away. It only operates one time. When you create the object, it is not part of the object once it's created. It ceases to be. As soon as that object creation statement executes, constructor disappears. So we need something that's similar to run to allow us to modify the data once the object's created, right? So we use what's called the modifier. And I'm going to define a modifier, and I will call it set values. Okay? And it basically is the exact same thing as the constructor, except for it gives us, it doesn't do anything when we're creating the object, and it gives us the ability to modify data once the object's already created. The one thing that it also does is it allows us to control how we access and modify data, because all your modification to the data is going to be through this set values function or any modifier. So you can have multiple modifiers. Like I could set username and password separately, right? Set user, something like that. And then I could have another def set fast, and that's a modifier as well. Modifiers are going to be what controls access or controls how you modify the data, right? And the biggest way that we can control that is by deciding what goes into the modifier. For instance, do I want them to be able to change their user ID?
No.
Easy way to control that is I just leave it out of the modifier. I just put in username and password, and that's it. So now I've just effectively controlled access to that data and ensured that it's not going to be modified by an outside user. If it's going to be modified, I want to modify it, right? Now that we have this data, we can retrieve it, right? So we have what's called accessors. So def, and I always use the prefix get. So they call them in a lot of programming classes, you'll see they'll call them getters and setters, but they're really accessors and modifiers. Set is for modification. You're setting a value to something. Get is you're retrieving something, right? So it's probably a good idea to continue to use those prefixes because it just makes the information easier to digest, at least for the time being. So now we do get user, because I want to be able to get the username, and everything has at least a parameter of self inside a class. And we're going to return self.username. Def get pass. Come on, there we go. All right, and then we're going to return self.pass W. Everybody with me so far? Okay. So we can also have methods inside here or functions inside here that actually do stuff like make calculations or print out things in a special way or anything like that. One of the big ones that you're going to run into is what's called the Str method. And every single object that's created from a class, including random, anything else that you're going to import into Python, anything that's an actual object, the object class itself from Python gets what's called the str method or the string method. And what that's designed to do is to, it's designed to print like basic information about the object. It's designed for testing and checking to make sure certain things are working right. And we can utilize that to our advantage. Let's go to give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's create a main method. Okay, I'll create this main here, and we'll just create a new user object. So I'll just say A equals user, right? So I'm creating a new object called A, and it is of the user class. So I'm using these building blocks here to build this A object. And when I'm complete, A is going to contain all this stuff, right? And so here I will put, what could I put? Let's put on, say, let's go not, there you go.
Wow. Wow.
Because he's not, but okay, so we just created that with that data. So I gave it these 2 bits of data, right? And my instance variables get the data that they need, and now my object's created. Now, if I want to modify that, I can use the modifier. But for right now, I want you to focus on the fact that this object A has been created. Now, if I print that directly, I can say print A, right? And if I run the main, hopefully there's no disasters in here. Oh, I did Java. So if I print this object directly, right? If I print A directly, it gives me this hash code, right? You don't need to know what any of that stuff means. You don't even need to know what hash codes are. You just need to know that that's the default printout from the str method. Anytime you take an object and you print it directly, it says run that str method. And even though I can't see it here, this A object of the user class contains an str method. And if I wanted to print something other than hash, I have to override it, right? So let's do that. I think that's how you spell str. Let's double check. I'm going to double check the spelling. Let's see. I just want to make sure I'm getting the syntax right because I have not used it in a while. There it is. Okay, so double underscore. So it's the same as in it, right? Double underscores on either side and a set of parentheses, right? Don't need, I believe you don't need self. Let's go ahead and put self so we can use the self dots. Okay, so now what I can do is I can control the printing that's going to come out of here, right? So let's just say return, and I'll put up a set of quotes, and I'm going to be like user info. Put spaces. It looks nicer with a few spaces. And then I would say new line. Let's go username. I would say plus username plus, go new line, and we'll put the password and add pass W. And what I'm forgetting here is the self dot. Remember that everything in your object has self dot. And Augie asked a good question earlier. What does a self refer to? Well, my object name is A. Self refers to the A. So it refers to the current object that you're working on, right? Self is a placeholder for an A. So the way that this actually exists in real life is now that I've created this object A, this part, this self, all the self dots that are contained in A are actually A dot username, A dot password, A dot, you know, whatever else, like A dot user ID, right? So this is actually A dot username, A dot password. Let's see. And self.password. And let's just throw in the user ID for fun. User ID. And then we'll add self.user ID. Everybody with me so far?
Yes.
Okay, so I printed this, right? But now that I've overridden the str method, if I print this again, it'll get mad at me because I probably screwed up some. Nice. Nice. Derek's done with the win. There we go. So now it actually prints something. So if I were to comment this out again, just so you can see, I get hash code, right? But when I've chosen to override the str method, I get this guy, and I kind of spaced this out a little bit too. I'm gonna, wait, no, I want to do this. Let's make this look a little nicer. I can do that, and then I can create another user. B equals user. Definitely. And then I can print B, and it will do the same thing for me.
Wait a minute.
Does that make sense?
I don't know who any of those people are.
Questions on that?
No.
Non-basketball related questions.
I don't care about
Wait,
basketball.
Mr. Robinette, you don't like LeBron?
Love them.